On the morning of the 22nd of October, 1983, in a federal penitentiary in southern Illinois, a prisoner named Thomas Silverstein was being escorted back from the shower. He was handcuffed. He was surrounded by 3 correctional officers. He was inside the most secure housing unit in the most secure prison the United States government operated. As the group moved down the tier, Silverstein used a small maneuver to position himself between the officers and stopped for a moment beside the cell of another inmate. The man in that cell reached through the bars with a homemade key and unlocked Silverstein's handcuffs. Then he passed him a knife. Silverstein turned and stabbed Officer Merle Clutts 40 times. Roughly 6 hours later, in the same unit, in an entirely separate incident, another prisoner named Clayton Fountain attacked a second group of officers. When Officer Robert Hoffman pulled Fountain off a colleague, Fountain stabbed him too. Hoffman died as well. 2 federal correctional officers murdered in a single day, in a single cell block, by 2 men who were already serving multiple life sentences and who, in the words of the director of the Bureau of Prisons, could not be deterred by any punishment the system was legally capable of adding. What the government did in response was not a policy that lasted a week or a month or a year. The Bureau of Prisons put the entire penitentiary into what it called a permanent lockdown. Every prisoner confined to his cell for almost the entire day. No work, no communal dining, no group movement, no yard. That lockdown lasted 23 years, and out of it came something the United States had never had before and now has everywhere: the Supermax. The idea that the correct way to handle the most dangerous people in custody is to seal them individually in concrete boxes, indefinitely, and simply wait. Every ADX cell in Colorado, every secure housing unit in California, every state-level Supermax built in the 3 decades that followed, traces back through a direct line to what happened in that one Illinois cell block on one October morning. This is the entire story of the United States Penitentiary at Marion, the prison the federal government built to replace Alcatraz, and the 23-year experiment that rebuilt American incarceration around the concrete box. If you find these stories worth telling, take a second to subscribe. It genuinely helps keep this channel alive. Now, let's step inside. To understand Marion, you have to start somewhere else entirely. You have to start on a rock in San Francisco Bay in the early 1960s, with a federal prison that had become an embarrassment the government could no longer afford to keep open. Alcatraz had opened as a federal penitentiary in 1934 and had spent 3 decades building the most fearsome reputation of any prison in the country. If you have watched our Alcatraz episode, you already know the shape of it. The island, the escape-proof mythology, the Battle of Alcatraz in 1946, the celebrity inmates whose names sold newspapers. By the early 1960s, that reputation was the only asset the island had left. The salt air had been eating the concrete and the steel for 30 years. Maintenance costs had become genuinely absurd for a facility that held only a few hundred men. And in June of 1962, 3 prisoners went into the water and were never accounted for, in an escape that punctured the one thing Alcatraz had left to sell, which was the claim that nobody ever got off the island. But there was a deeper problem, and it is the one that explains everything about the place the government built next. By the 1960s, American corrections had officially committed itself, at least in its public language, to rehabilitation. The purpose of a federal prison was no longer supposed to be simply to warehouse a man where he could not hurt anybody. It was supposed to be to return him to society, improved. And Alcatraz, with its silence rules and its punishment cells and its documented brutality, was a 19th century artifact sitting in the middle of a 20th century philosophy. It was not just expensive, it was politically indefensible. So Attorney General Robert F. Kennedy signed off on a replacement. Alcatraz closed on the 21st of March, 1963. That same year, in a quiet stretch of farmland in Williamson County, Illinois, about 9 miles south of the town of Marion and 300 miles from Chicago. The United States Penitentiary at Marion opened its gates. Understand what the government said it was building, because the gap between that promise and what actually happened is the entire story of this video. Marion was announced as a modern, humane, rehabilitation-focused facility. The new penitentiary came with an explicit federal promise of an abuse-free institution. It was designed to hold 500 men, described in congressional testimony by one of its own superintendents, as adult male felons who are difficult to control. Not monsters, not the worst of the worst, difficult to control. A management problem to be solved with programs and staff and modern correctional science. Physically, it looked nothing like the fortress it replaced. No stone walls, no Gothic cell house, no island. Marion was low, flat, and functional. Mid-century concrete blocks laid out across open Illinois farmland, ringed by double chain-link fencing and razor wire, with floodlight towers at the corners. From the road, it could have been a school district's maintenance depot or a state agricultural station. That anonymity was intentional. The government was building the opposite of Alcatraz on purpose. And here is the first myth correction, because almost every popular account of Marion gets this wrong. The story usually told is that when Alcatraz closed, the prisoners were loaded up and shipped to Marion, and the Rock's population simply moved to Illinois. That is not what happened. Alcatraz's prisoners were not transferred directly to Marion at all. The Bureau of Prisons dispersed them across the federal system, and researchers who have studied the decision believe the reason was political. Moving the most notorious and most politically connected prisoners in America as a single group into a brand new facility risked exactly the kind of public attention and organized resistance the Bureau was trying to avoid. They wanted to test the new prison first. It was not until the late 1960s, several years after the island closed, that former Alcatraz prisoners began arriving at Marion in any number. By then, something had already begun to change inside the building, because the promise did not survive the decade. In 1968, 5 years after opening, Marion implemented a program called the Control and Rehabilitation Effort. Everyone involved called it CARE, which is one of those institutional acronyms that reads like satire once you know what it actually involved. CARE was a behavior modification program. The theory behind it belonged to a specific moment in American psychology, when the idea that human behavior could be systematically reshaped through controlled environments and applied conditioning had moved from the laboratory into the prison system with remarkably little resistance. Prisoners deemed disruptive would be placed into CARE, and what happened to them there fell into two categories. They were put in solitary confinement, or they were put through what the program called group therapy, sessions in which a prisoner sat in front of staff and other inmates and was systematically confronted about his deviant behavior and pressured to change. The word rehabilitation was in the name of the program. What the program did, in practice, was isolate men and then apply sustained psychological pressure to them. This channel has now documented enough of these to say the pattern out loud. Whenever an American institution attaches a therapeutic vocabulary to a practice, look at what the practice physically consists of, not what it is called. The Adjustment Center at San Quentin was a segregation unit. Occupational therapy at Pilgrim State was unpaid labor. The control and rehabilitation effort at Marion was solitary confinement with a curriculum attached. CARE mattered because it established the operating principle Marion would run on for the next 4 decades, that this institution's function was not to hold prisoners generally, but to receive the specific individuals other prisons could not manage, and to break their resistance through isolation. By 1973, the logic had hardened into architecture. That year, Marion created the first blocks of what it called control unit cells. These were segregation cells, and a prisoner, assigned to one, could expect to spend 23 to 24 hours a day inside it. The cells were specifically designed to limit or eliminate a man's contact with other human beings, inside the prison and outside it. And the Bureau of Prisons did something with the control unit that turned Marion from a prison into a national instrument. Rather than using those cells only for prisoners already at Marion, the Bureau began transferring men into them from federal institutions across the entire country. If a prisoner anywhere in the system was judged to be seriously disrupting operations, he could be moved to Illinois and placed in a control unit cell. It is worth pausing on who was actually being sent there, because the population of the control unit was never limited to men who had killed somebody. The Bureau's own criterion was behavior that seriously disrupted operations at another institution, and that phrase covered a range considerably wider than violence. Researchers who studied Marion's population in this period found that the men transferred in included a substantial number the Bureau categorized as incorrigibles, or in the internal shorthand of the era, 2%ers, prisoners who resisted institutional authority, who filed grievances, who organized other inmates, who assaulted staff, or who simply would not comply. Some assaulted people, some did not. And a meaningful portion of the control unit population in the 1970s were political prisoners in the plain sense of the term, men whose convictions were connected to their membership in organizations the federal government considered subversive. Prisoners associated with the Black Panther Party, members of the American Indian Movement, Puerto Rican nationalists, including Rafael Cancel Miranda, who had been at Alcatraz before Marion existed and who is regarded in Puerto Rico as a national figure, anarchists, members of the Japanese Red Army. That combination is the thing to hold on to. The federal government built a facility above maximum security, filled it with men convicted of extreme violence, and then also placed inside it people whose defining offense was organized political opposition, in the same cells, under the same regime, on the same administrative authority, with no hearing required before a transfer. By 1979, the Bureau made the arrangement official in the bluntest possible way. Federal prisons were rated by security level, 1 through 5, with 5 being maximum. That year, the Bureau designated Marion the only Level 6 institution in the United States, a category that had not previously existed, created for a single building, to indicate that it sat above maximum security entirely. The government had spent 16 years building the anti-Alcatraz, and had produced something considerably harder than Alcatraz had ever been. The men inside noticed, and through the 1970s, Marion produced a run of escape attempts that are genuinely difficult to believe happened at the same facility within a single decade. The first came on the 21st of July, 1971, when a prisoner named Warren George Briggs climbed 2 15-foot fences, got clear of the grounds, and made it all the way to Kansas City, Missouri, by way of Interstate 57. 4 days later, he walked into an FBI office and turned himself in. His stated reason for the entire exercise, according to the reporting at the time, was that he wanted to draw public attention to an invention of his, a water desalination process he believed could purify water for mankind. That is the least strange escape in this section. On the 10th of October, 1975, 5 prisoners walked out through the front door of the United States Penitentiary at Marion. Not over a fence, not through a tunnel, out the front. One of the 5 worked as an electrician inside the prison and had been assigned, at some point, to work on the locking system for the main doors. Using that access, the group built an electronic device capable of opening the prison gates and converted a radio into a remote control that could open every door in their path. All 5 were eventually recaptured, but the last of them was not taken until the 31st of October, 1975, in Canada. Then came 1978, and a man named Garrett Brock Trapnell, If you're finding this one worth your time, a like goes a long way toward keeping these deep dives alive. Trapnell was at Marion, serving life for air piracy. On the 28th of January, 1972, he had boarded TWA Flight 2 from Los Angeles to New York, with a .45 caliber pistol, smuggled aboard inside a plaster cast on his arm, and hijacked it over Chicago, threatening to ram the aircraft into a terminal at JFK unless he received a ransom. The FBI retook the plane during a crew change at Kennedy. Trapnell was shot, wounded, and arrested, and the federal system eventually deposited him at Marion. He did not stop working. On the 24th of May, 1978, a 43-year-old woman named Barbara Ann Oswald walked into a charter helicopter service in St. Louis and hired an aircraft. She explained that she wanted to fly over some real estate she was considering buying. Oswald was a United States Army Staff Sergeant on leave, and she was a friend of Trapnell's. Once the helicopter was airborne, she produced a gun, put it on the pilot, and ordered him to fly to the United States Penitentiary at Marion and set down inside the prison yard. The plan was to lift out Trapnell and 3 other inmates, including Martin McNally, who was himself serving time for hijacking an airliner. The pilot was a man named Alan Barkledge. He was a Vietnam veteran. As he brought the helicopter down toward the yard, Barkledge moved on her, got hold of the weapon, and when she reached into her purse for a second gun, he shot and killed her. Barbara Oswald died in a helicopter on the grounds of a federal penitentiary in southern Illinois, and the escape never got off the aircraft. Trapnell was placed under an order that the Bureau of Prisons described in language it did not use casually: no human contact. He spent essentially the rest of his life in isolation and died in 1993 of emphysema at the Federal Medical Center in Springfield, Missouri. But the story was not finished, and what happened next is the part that stays with you. On the 21st of December, 1978, 7 months after her mother was shot to death in that helicopter, 17-year-old Robin Oswald boarded TWA Flight 541, a DC-9, running from Louisville to Kansas City, with 87 people aboard. Somewhere in the air, she announced that she had dynamite strapped to her body, and she demanded that the aircraft be flown to Williamson County Regional Airport, and that Garrett Brock Trapnell be released. The plane landed near Marion. 10 hours of negotiation followed with FBI agents. The passengers who were on that flight later described her as a beautiful but serious girl who never showed alarm at anything she was doing. Eventually, she surrendered. The dynamite was fake. A 17-year-old girl hijacked a passenger jet full of civilians in the same year and for the same man, 7 months after her mother died attempting the identical thing. The 1970s at Marion also produced one escape that ended in gunfire outside the walls. 2 prisoners, working in dense fog that had settled over the flat Illinois farmland, got over the fence and clear of the grounds. A third was caught before he made it off the property. The 2 who got out were tracked to the nearby community of Cypress, where FBI agents and the Johnson County Sheriff, a man named Ellery Faulkner, confronted them. In the exchange of fire that followed, Sheriff Faulkner was shot in the chest. He survived because he was wearing a bulletproof vest. That incident is worth including, for a reason beyond the drama. Every one of these escapes and attempts, from Briggs walking into an FBI office to talk about desalination, to 5 men strolling out the front door with a modified radio, to a helicopter landing in the yard, to a teenage girl on a hijacked DC-9, was used inside the Bureau of Prisons as evidence for the same conclusion, that the problem was insufficient control. Not one of them prompted a serious institutional question about whether concentrating the most desperate men in the federal system into a single building and steadily removing their remaining options might be producing the desperation. Marion's response to all of it was to tighten. Isolation expanded. Movement contracted. The Bureau kept sending its most difficult prisoners from across the country into a facility that was becoming more compressed and more volatile with every year. And by the early 1980s, the numbers describing who was actually inside that building had become genuinely extraordinary. In 1983, a third of Marion's prisoners were serving either life sentences or terms of 70 years or more. 2 years later, 40% of the population was serving time for murder, manslaughter, or assault with intent to kill. Read those numbers again and think about what they mean operationally. A prison disciplinary system runs on the ability to make a prisoner's situation worse. Take away privileges, add time, transfer him somewhere harder. But if a man is already serving multiple life sentences with no possibility of release, already housed in the highest security institution the federal government operates, and there is no federal death penalty in force, then the system has run out of things to threaten him with. There is nothing left to take. The Bureau of Prisons had spent 20 years concentrating every man in the federal system who could not be controlled by consequences into one building, and then discovered it had no consequences left to apply. It is also worth noting what the officers working inside that building were dealing with, because they are the people this story most often reduces to a plot point. Marion's staff walked corridors every day, unarmed, escorting men who had already killed inside prison walls and who had nothing further to lose. Media reports over the institution's history record at least 3 guards assaulted, 2 guards killed, and 2 prisoners murdered inside it. The correctional officers at Marion were not policymakers. They did not design the classification system that concentrated that population into their workplace, and they did not write the court opinions that kept it there. They were the people standing in the corridor when the decisions made in Washington produced their consequences. 2 of those men were named Thomas Silverstein and Clayton Fountain. Silverstein had arrived in the federal system as a bank robber. He was 19 when he was first convicted of armed robbery, and he came into federal custody in his early 20s on a bank robbery conviction connected to his own father and a cousin. He was not, at the point of his conviction, anyone the public had heard of. What happened to him afterward is a case study in how the American prison system manufactures the very population it then builds supermaxes to contain. Inside, Silverstein became a member of the Aryan Brotherhood, the white supremacist prison gang that had formed in California in the 1960s and had spread through the federal system. The Bureau moved him from institution to institution as the violence around him escalated, which is itself the mechanism worth watching. Each transfer sent him to a harder facility with a more concentrated population. Each harder facility increased both the danger to him and the value of gang affiliation as protection. By the time he reached Marion, the system had spent years producing exactly the person it would eventually build an entire architecture to contain. In 1981, he was implicated in the killing of an inmate named Robert Chappelle at Marion. Then, on the 27th of September 1982, Silverstein and Clayton Fountain killed another prisoner, Raymond Smith, stabbing him 67 times, and then dragged his body up and down the catwalk in front of the other cells so the rest of the unit could see it. Silverstein received another life sentence for that. Silverstein's own account of the environment at Marion in that period, which he maintained for the rest of his life, was that staff deliberately engineered conflict between prisoners and that the guards, in his phrasing, wanted one of them to kill the other. That is his claim. It has never been substantiated, and the men in a position to confirm or deny it were the same men he was accusing. What is not in dispute is that by 1983, the control unit at Marion held a small group of prisoners who had already killed inside the prison, who were serving sentences that could not meaningfully be extended, and who were being moved through corridors every day by unarmed officers. There is also a structural detail about the 1983 killings that tends to get lost in the retelling, and it matters, because it explains how a handcuffed prisoner, surrounded by officers, was able to kill one of them. Marion's control unit was designed around the assumption that restraint plus supervision equals safety. A prisoner leaving his cell was cuffed. Officers escorted him. Officers were unarmed, because arming staff inside a housing unit means introducing a weapon into an environment where it can be taken. The entire system depended on the physical restraints working and on the cells around the escort route remaining secure. Both assumptions failed on the same morning, and they failed because of something the architecture could not account for: other prisoners. Silverstein did not defeat his handcuffs. Randy Gometz did, from inside a locked cell, with a key made inside the prison. The knife came from the same place. A control unit built to isolate men from one another had, over years, been quietly reassembled by the men inside it into a network capable of moving tools, coordinating timing, and delivering both to a specific point on a corridor at a specific moment. That is the part the Bureau took away from October of 1983, and it explains why the response was total rather than targeted. If the failure had been one officer's mistake, you retrain the officer. If the failure is that a population of men can rebuild a functioning conspiracy inside a system designed to prevent exactly that, then the only answer the institution can see is to stop letting them out of the cells at all. Which brings us to the 22nd of October, 1983, and to a correctional officer named Merle Clutts. Clutts was a career Bureau of Prisons officer. The dispute between him and Silverstein was, by the accounts that survive, small in the way that prison disputes are almost always small. Clutts had removed some of Silverstein's belongings from his cell, and Silverstein regarded it as deliberate harassment. He spent months planning what he did about it. That morning, Silverstein was let out for a shower and was being escorted back, handcuffed, with officers around him. He arranged himself so that Clutts was ahead of him and the other officers behind, and stopped beside the cell of a prisoner named Randy Gometz. Gometz unlocked Silverstein's handcuffs with a homemade key and handed him a shank. Silverstein stabbed Merle Clutts 40 times. Clutts died. The prison did not go into immediate general lockdown. Roughly 6 hours later, in the same H unit, Clayton Fountain attacked a group of officers escorting him. Officer Robert Hoffman pulled Fountain off a colleague who was being stabbed, and Fountain turned on him. Hoffman died too. 2 officers, 1 unit, 1 day. The killings did not stay a local news story. The Attorney General of the United States, William French Smith, went public with an argument that made explicit what the Bureau had privately understood for years, that these men were killing, in his phrasing, for sport, and doing it with effective impunity, because they were already serving the maximum sentence federal law allowed, while housed in the disciplinary section of a maximum security prison. He urged Congress to reinstate the federal death penalty, specifically on the strength of what had happened at Marion. And in the meantime, the Bureau of Prisons did the thing that changed everything. We put hundreds of hours into each of these. If that's worth something to you, hit subscribe. In November of 1983, the entire United States Penitentiary at Marion went into what the Bureau called a permanent lockdown. The word permanent was not rhetorical, and that is the detail almost nobody registers. American prisons go into lockdown regularly, after a fight or a riot or a security failure, and lockdowns end. This one did not. Every prisoner in the institution was confined to his cell for the overwhelming majority of every day. Communal dining ended. Group work ended. Group movement ended. The prison stopped operating as a prison in any sense a person from the previous century would have recognized, and became a system of individually sealed boxes with staff moving between them. Norman Carlson, the director of the Bureau of Prisons at the time, defended the decision for the rest of his life, and his defense is worth quoting accurately, because it is not a stupid argument. As draconian as the permanent lockdown was, Carlson said, He believed it was the only way to deal with what he described as a very small subset of the inmate population who show absolutely no concern for human life. And he made the point that the two men who had killed the officers were already serving multiple life sentences, so adding another one would have accomplished nothing at all. That is the honest case for the Supermax, made by the man who built the first one, and this channel is not going to pretend it does not exist. Merle Clutts and Robert Hoffman went to work on a Saturday morning and did not come home. Somebody had to answer the question of what to do next, and the people asking it were not academics. The question this video is actually about is what happened to the answer. Because Marion's lockdown was implemented as an emergency response to a specific event, and then it simply never ended. It ran for 23 years. Prisoners who had been nowhere near H Unit on that October morning, who had never assaulted anybody, who were transferred into Marion years afterward from other institutions, served their time under conditions designed in the immediate aftermath of two murders they had no connection to. An emergency measure became a permanent architecture, and then it became a model. Before the lawsuits, it is worth describing the physical reality, because the abstraction of the phrase 23 hours a day does a great deal of work in hiding what it actually means. A man in a control unit cell at Marion in this period lived in a space of roughly 6 feet by 8 feet, concrete floor, concrete walls, a poured concrete slab for a bunk, a stainless steel toilet and sink combined into one fixture. The door was solid, not barred, with a narrow slot through which food trays passed, and through which a prisoner had to back up and put his hands to be cuffed before it opened. Light was artificial and controlled from outside the cell. The unit was structured in tiers, and conditions varied between them, which was itself the point. Marion operated a graded system in which a prisoner could theoretically progress from the most restrictive units toward a pre-release unit whose conditions approximated an ordinary maximum security prison. In practice, the men in the harshest units could spend years without reaching the next tier. Out of cell time, in the most restrictive housing, came to a minimum of about 5 hours per week, not per day, per week. Recreation meant being moved, in restraints, to a separate enclosed space, alone. Meals arrived through the slot. Religious services, where they happened at all, were limited by what the institution judged security permitted, and every movement outside the cell involved a search. The rectal cavity searches that became a central issue in the litigation were not occasional. They were routine, performed on prisoners moving to and from visits, medical appointments, and legal calls, and the court record acknowledged both that inmates at Marion had genuinely used the rectal cavity to conceal contraband, and that the searches were conducted at a frequency and in a manner the prisoners described as brutal and humiliating. What life inside the lockdown Marion actually consisted of became a matter of federal record because the prisoners sued. In 1984, a class action was filed on behalf of a prisoner named Ronnie Brusino and, eventually, on behalf of every man confined at Marion and every man who might be confined there in the future. The case was Brusino against Carlson, naming the director of the Bureau of Prisons directly. The allegations were specific: excessive force by staff, rectal searches performed routinely, and, the prisoners alleged, brutally, the sheer quantity of time men spent sealed in cells, and the fact that the procedures by which a prisoner was sent to Marion in the first place had essentially no due process attached to them at all. The litigation was not a formality. Testimony on the request for injunctive relief began in January of 1985 and ran for nearly 28 days in front of a federal magistrate. The court held 4 more days of hearings in December of 1986, and the district judge did something judges rarely do. He told both sides he intended to make a surprise visit to the prison, and then, on the 11th of December, 1986, he and his law clerks toured Marion unannounced, accompanied by counsel from both sides. 50 prisoners testified to beatings and other brutalities. The magistrate's findings concluded that those 50 men were not credible witnesses, and that the single prisoner who testified that no beatings occurred was believable. The prisoners lost, and then they appealed, and the appellate decision is one of the most extraordinary documents in the history of American corrections because of what it concedes. The Seventh Circuit Court of Appeals did not dispute that conditions at Marion were terrible. It described them, in its own published opinion, as ghastly. It called them sordid and horrible. It said that the whole picture was depressing in the extreme, and then it ruled that none of it was unconstitutional. The court's reasoning was that the controls instituted in the fall of 1983 formed a unitary and integrated system for dealing with what it called the nation's least corrigible inmates, and that dismantling any individual piece of it would destroy the rationale of the whole and impair its effectiveness. It noted, pointedly, that the prisoners' own attorneys had offered no suggestion for how order might be maintained at Marion by any other means, and it made the same observation Carlson had made, that men with no expectation of release and no danger of execution cannot be deterred by the threat of punishment from killing the inmates and guards who displease them. The court did record, in the same opinion, that the prisoners' alleged conditions, even worse than what it had described, including guards beating prisoners regularly and conducting the rectal searches in a manner the plaintiffs called brutal, painful, and humiliating. And it noted, in a single dry sentence, that these allegations had aroused the interest of Amnesty International, which had criticized the management of the prison. Sit with the full shape of that. A federal appellate court examined an American prison, described the conditions in it as ghastly, sordid, horrible, and depressing in the extreme, acknowledged that an international human rights organization had taken an interest in it, and concluded that the Constitution permitted all of it, because nobody could think of anything else to do. It is worth understanding why the ruling came out that way, because it was not simply a court siding with the government out of deference. The Eighth Amendment analysis American courts apply to prison conditions asks whether a condition is cruel and unusual, and both halves of that phrase carry weight. Conditions that are severe but standard across the system are harder to strike down than conditions that are unique. And by the time the appellate court ruled in 1988, Marion's regime had already begun to spread. Each institution that adopted a version of it made the original marginally more ordinary, and therefore marginally more defensible. The court also confronted a practical problem it could not solve. It observed directly that the prisoners' able counsel had no suggestions for how order might be maintained at Marion by other means. That is a genuine problem for a judge. A court can order an institution to stop doing something. It cannot design a prison. And faced with 2 dead officers, a population of men serving unextendable sentences, and no proposed alternative, the court declined to dismantle the only system anyone had put in front of it. The consequence is a piece of American legal architecture that still stands. Brusino against Carlson has been cited in Supermax litigation for decades, and its central move, conceding that conditions are appalling while holding that they are constitutionally permissible in the absence of a workable alternative, has been reproduced in case after case. That ruling is the legal foundation the American Supermax was built on. It did not merely permit Marion to continue. It told every corrections department in the country that this model would survive judicial review. They built accordingly. There is a second consequence of the lockdown that took decades to become visible, and it is the one that eventually turned solitary confinement from a corrections argument into a medical one. When you seal a human being in a concrete room and remove essentially all social contact, meaningful activity, and sensory variation, the mind does not simply wait. Clinicians studying prisoners held in long-term isolation in the decades after Marion documented a recurring cluster of effects: severe anxiety, panic, difficulty with concentration and memory, intrusive obsessive thoughts, paranoia, hallucinations in some cases, and a distinctive deterioration in the ability to tolerate ordinary social interaction afterward. The condition is severe enough that some researchers argued it constituted a specific syndrome caused by the conditions themselves rather than by any pre-existing illness. The population most affected was, predictably, the one already carrying mental illness on the way in, and American prisons by the 1990s held an enormous number of such people, in significant part because the state hospital system this channel has documented at Pilgrim, at Byberry, and at Central State had been dismantled over the preceding 40 years without anything adequate built to replace it. A meaningful share of the people who would once have been held in a state psychiatric hospital were now in prison, and a share of those ended up in the units least survivable for someone with a psychiatric condition. None of that was known in 1983, and it would be dishonest to suggest the Bureau of Prisons was ignoring evidence that did not yet exist in that form. But it was known by the early 2000s, and the model kept expanding anyway. Through the late 1980s and the 1990s, state after state constructed its own version. California opened Pelican Bay in 1989 with a security housing unit designed around the same principle. By the mid-1990s, there were Supermax facilities, or Supermax units, in the substantial majority of American states, holding tens of thousands of people in conditions that would have been unrecognizable to a prison administrator in 1960. And the federal government built the purest expression of the idea. In 1994, the United States Penitentiary Administrative Maximum Facility opened at Florence, Colorado, and it was designed from the ground up around the control unit model that Marion had improvised in an emergency 11 years earlier. ADX Florence was not a prison retrofitted for isolation. It was a prison whose entire architecture assumed it. The moment ADX opened, Marion lost the distinction it had held for 3 decades. It was no longer the end of the line. The end of the line had moved to Colorado. If this story is hitting different from the version you've heard before, that's the point. Consider subscribing so you don't miss the next one. Which leaves the 2 men who started it and what the system they created did to them. Clayton Fountain was, by the Bureau's own designation, the most dangerous prisoner in the federal system. He had killed 3 inmates and a correctional officer with improvised weapons. After the murder of Officer Hoffman, the government faced a genuine logistical problem. There was no federal death penalty available for what he had done, and there was no facility in the system that could safely hold him alongside anyone else. So the Bureau of Prisons built him a cell of his own. Fountain was moved to the Federal Medical Center in Springfield, Missouri, and housed in an arrangement constructed specifically for one man, in which he had no meaningful contact with other prisoners for the remainder of his life. And what happened to Clayton Fountain inside that cell is the strangest turn in this entire story. He became religious, not superficially and not briefly. Fountain became a lay member of the Trappist order, the Cistercians of the Strict Observance, a Catholic monastic order whose members traditionally live in silence, in enclosure, in a fixed cell, under a rule of prayer and contemplation. A priest visited him. He kept the hours. He read. There is a book about him, written years later, called A Different Kind of Cell, about a murderer who became a monk, and the title contains the whole uncomfortable idea. The federal government had built a man a permanent isolation cell as the most severe punishment available to it, and the man had responded by adopting a 900-year-old religious tradition organized around voluntarily living in exactly that way. Nobody released him. Nobody reduced his sentence. Clayton Fountain died in his cell in 2004, at 49, having spent the last 21 years of his life in an isolation cell built for one man. Whether any of that constitutes redemption is not a question this channel is equipped to settle, and the families of the 4 people he killed are entitled to their own answer. What is documentable is the fact of it, that the harshest sanction the United States government could construct turned out to be, in physical terms, close to a monastic cell, and that one of the 2 men it was built for spent 2 decades inside it, keeping the hours. Thomas Silverstein's path was the opposite, and it is the one that should be sitting in your chest by the end of this video. After the murder of Merle Clutts, the Bureau placed Silverstein under an order of indefinite solitary confinement, not a fixed term, not a sanction with an end date attached, subject to review, indefinite, because with no federal death penalty available in 1983 and life sentences already stacked on him, the Bureau concluded that permanent isolation was the only sanction it had left. He went into that isolation in October of 1983. He was moved through a series of arrangements over the decades. A specially constructed cell at Leavenworth, which viewers of our Leavenworth episode will remember. Then eventually, ADX Florence in Colorado, the Supermax his own actions had helped bring into existence. He stayed there. Thomas Silverstein spent approximately 35 years in solitary confinement, the longest continuous period of any prisoner in the history of the federal system of the United States. He entered isolation the year Ronald Reagan was in his first term. He was still in it, under 3 presidents who had not yet held national office when he went in. In February of 2019, he was taken from ADX to a hospital in Colorado for heart surgery. He did not go back. Thomas Silverstein died on the 11th of May, 2019, at St. Anthony Hospital in Lakewood, at 67 years old, of complications from that surgery. He had not been in general population with another human being since 1983. A journalist who covered his case wrote that Silverstein's fate might be the prototype of what the government had in mind for other infamous prisoners, to bury them in strata of Supermax security to the point of oblivion. That was written in 2007. Silverstein had another 12 years to go. And here is the part that has to be said clearly, because this channel is not in the business of turning men who murdered correctional officers into martyrs. Merle Clutts had a family. Robert Hoffman had a family. Both men went to work at a federal penitentiary on an ordinary Saturday and were killed by prisoners who had planned it. The Bureau of Prisons memorializes both of them as fallen officers, and every argument about solitary confinement in the United States since 1983 has had to be made across the fact of their deaths. The question this story leaves is not whether Thomas Silverstein and Clayton Fountain deserved sympathy. It is what a country does with a policy that was designed in the immediate aftermath of 2 murders, extended for 23 years, applied to tens of thousands of people who had nothing to do with those murders, and then expanded into a national architecture, without anyone ever going back to check whether the emergency it was built for still existed. Before that ending, there was a decade in which Marion continued running the regime, while the world outside it began to argue about what the regime was. Amnesty International's interest, noted almost in passing by the Seventh Circuit, did not go away. Activist organizations formed specifically around the institution, including a group that named itself simply for its objective, the Committee to End the Marion Lockdown. Congressional attention came and went. A local newspaper headline from the 31st of March, 1985, gave the place the title that stuck to it for the rest of its operational life. The Southern Illinoisan called Marion the new Alcatraz. The prison administration pushed back on the criticism directly, and the surviving correspondence shows how. When outside researchers wrote to Marion's warden about prisoner allegations, the response they received suggested they might want to look at the criminal and institutional records of the men making the claims before putting their faith completely in the statements. Mail from advocacy organizations to prisoners was returned to sender over language the institution judged inappropriate. One mailing was rejected because a leaflet included the phrase, Join us. The argument had a shape that will be familiar from every institution in this series. The people making the allegations were, by definition, people the institution had already classified as untrustworthy. That classification was then used as the reason to discount the allegations, and a federal magistrate, presented with 50 prisoners testifying to beatings and one testifying that there were none, resolved it exactly the way the institution had been arguing it should be resolved. Marion's lockdown ended in 2006, not because a court ordered it, and not because the Bureau of Prisons concluded it had been a mistake, but for the ordinary institutional reason that the function had moved elsewhere. ADX Florence had been absorbing the federal system's most dangerous prisoners for over a decade, and Marion had become an enormously expensive facility running a punishing regime on a population that no longer justified it. So the Bureau downgraded it. Marion's designation was changed to medium security. Major renovations were carried out, and the population went from 383 prisoners to 901. Men now walked to a dining hall in a building where, a few years earlier, walking anywhere had been the thing the entire architecture existed to prevent. 23 years of permanent lockdown ended with a paperwork reclassification. If the story stopped there, it would be a story about American corrections learning something, or at least about a chapter closing. It does not stop there. In March of 2008, 2 years after the downgrade, the Bureau of Prisons quietly established a new unit inside Marion. It was called a Communication Management Unit, and it was the second one in the federal system, joining a unit that had opened at Terre Haute, Indiana, in 2006. A Communication Management Unit is not a Supermax. Prisoners in a CMU are not held in 23-hour isolation. What is controlled is not the body. It is the ability to speak to anyone outside. The restrictions are documented. All written correspondence to and from a CMU prisoner is reviewed by staff and can be rejected. All telephone calls must be live monitored by staff, recorded, analyzed, and conducted in English. A request to speak another language requires 10 days advance notice and a translator. Where a general population federal prisoner has 300 minutes of phone time a month, a CMU prisoner gets 1 call per week, 15 minutes maximum, and the warden has discretion to reduce that call to 3 minutes. All visits are non-contact, conducted through glass, on a telephone handset. Prisoners may communicate only with approved contacts. Prisoners and staff alike call these units Little Guantanamo. The Bureau's official explanation is that CMUs house inmates who, because of their offense or their conduct, require increased monitoring of communications. People convicted on terrorism charges, people attempting to coordinate criminal activity from inside, people with a documented history of abusing communication privileges. That is a coherent category, and there are people in these units who plainly fit it. The litigation says the category was never actually defined. In 2010, a group of CMU prisoners and 2 of their spouses sued the Attorney General of the United States in federal court. Documents obtained through that case, and later released by the Center for Constitutional Rights, established that the Bureau of Prisons had no formal written policy governing who should be placed in a CMU, and no defined process by which a prisoner could earn his way back out. Neither unit had gone through the formal review process the law required when it was opened. And the center's analysis found that roughly 60% of the people held in the CMUs were Muslim, against roughly 6% of the federal prison population overall. Investigative reporting has documented cases that sit uneasily against the terrorism framing. As recently as 2024, coverage described a man convicted of leaking classified documents, a case involving no violence whatsoever, transferred into the CMU at Marion, and calling a friend on his first day to tell her, quickly, before the call could be cut, that everything they said from then on would be live recorded. Marion's roster over the decades collected names that most people would be surprised to learn shared an address. John Gotti, the boss of the Gambino crime family in New York from 1985 until his conviction in 1992, was held at Marion. Victor Bout, the Russian arms dealer whose career was extensive enough to inspire a Hollywood film, served part of a 25-year sentence there. Francis Schaefer Cox, the Alaska militia leader, convicted in a murder conspiracy, was sent there. Aldrich Ames, the CIA officer who spent 9 years passing American intelligence to the Soviet Union and then Russia in one of the most damaging espionage cases in the country's history, has been held in the communications unit system. John Walker Lind, captured in Afghanistan in 2001 and known in the American press as the American Taliban, was housed in a communication management unit. And in one of the sharper contrasts in the institution's history, the minimum security satellite camp that sits immediately adjacent to the penitentiary held Pete Rose, the all-time hits leader in Major League Baseball, who served 5 months there in 1990 and 1991 for filing false tax returns. The same fence line, roughly the same acreage, and on one side of it, a man doing 5 months for tax fraud with a work assignment and a visiting schedule, and on the other side, men who had not touched another human being in a decade. Marion is still open. In 2024, its designation changed again, and it is now formally the Federal Correctional Institution at Marion, rather than the United States Penitentiary. On the 16th of May 2025, a tornado struck the facility. No injuries were reported. It houses a medium security population, an adjacent minimum security satellite camp that has held its own share of famous names over the years, and one of the 2 communication management units in the United States. Zoom out from Marion, and the shape is one this channel has traced through prison after prison and asylum after asylum. But Marion runs the cycle faster and more visibly than any institution we have covered. An institution is founded on a stated humane premise. Alcatraz was indefensible, so the government built a modern facility in Illinois and promised an abuse-free environment focused on rehabilitation. Within 5 years, the rehabilitation program was solitary confinement, with a therapeutic vocabulary attached. Within 10 years, it had become permanent architecture. Within 16 years, the government had invented a security classification that did not previously exist in order to describe this one building. And then 2 officers were murdered, and the emergency response to those murders became the operating philosophy of American corrections for the next 3 decades. At no point in that sequence did anyone lie. Every step was public. The congressional testimony exists. The court opinions are published. A federal appellate court wrote the words ghastly and sordid and horrible into the official record, and then said the Constitution allowed it. That is the thing about Marion that distinguishes it from Byberry, from Pilgrim State, from Dozier. There was no exposé here. There were no smuggled photographs, no whistleblower, no buried graves that somebody had to dig up decades later to prove existed. Everything about Marion was documented, litigated, appealed, and affirmed in the open. The country looked directly at it in a federal courtroom, with attorneys on both sides and a judge who walked the tiers himself and decided this was acceptable. And the men at the center of it ended where the logic ended. Clayton Fountain, the most dangerous prisoner in the federal system, was given a permanent cell of his own as the harshest available punishment, and spent his remaining years in it as a Trappist, dying in 2004 in a form of enclosure that monastic orders have chosen voluntarily for 900 years. Thomas Silverstein went into a box in October of 1983 and came out of one in February of 2019 on his way to a hospital where he died 3 months later, having spent 35 years in isolation, more than any other federal prisoner in the history of the United States. Merle Clutts and Robert Hoffman never came home at all. The prison itself is still there, 9 miles south of a town in southern Illinois, on flat farmland, behind chain link. It does not look like anything. It never did. That was the entire point of the design, And it is the reason that almost nobody outside the corrections world has heard of the building where the modern American Supermax was invented, while millions of people a year take a ferry out to look at the ruin it was built to replace. There is one more comparison worth drawing before the end, because this channel has now covered both ends of it. At Alcatraz, the government held roughly 300 men on an island, and the institution was so notorious, so photographed, so relentlessly written about, that it became culturally impossible to sustain. The visibility killed it. Alcatraz closed in 1963, in large part because everybody could see it. At Marion, the government held a comparable number of men in a low concrete building in a county most Americans could not find on a map, and ran a regime substantially harsher than anything Alcatraz ever operated, for 23 years, in a facility that generated almost no cultural presence at all. There is no film about Marion. There is no ferry. There is no gift shop. The lesson American corrections took from the closure of Alcatraz was not that the regime had been too harsh. It was that the island had been too visible. Alcatraz is a national park with a gift shop. Marion has a communication management unit and a satellite camp. Every institution in this series has a physical object at its center that the story keeps returning to. At Willard, it was 400 suitcases in an attic. At Dozier, it was a leather strap. At San Quentin,